My billionaire brother told security to remove me from his wedding. The bride stopped the ceremony. The first hand closed around my elbow just as my brother was about to say his vows. The second guard moved in front of me, blocking my view of the altar with the polished black wall of his suit. Beyond him, 300 guests sat beneath a ceiling of white orchids and suspended candles, watching the billionaire founder of Vale Meridian marry the daughter of a former senator. My brother Adrian did not look surprised to see security touching me. He looked relieved. He gave the smallest nod, the kind he used in boardrooms when he wanted an inconvenience removed without interrupting the presentation. I had crossed an ocean because his bride had sent me a handwritten invitation. I had worn our mother's blue dress because Adrian once said it was the only thing from our old life worth keeping. And now, in front of cameras, investors, politicians, and the people who believed his success story began in a college dorm room, he ordered strangers to drag me out of his wedding. I did not fight. I had spent too many years carrying my brother to make a scene at the moment he chose to bury me. I had taken one step toward the aisle when the bride lifted her veil and said, clearly enough for every microphone to catch it, "Stop the ceremony. If Elena leaves, I leave too." The room did not erupt. Wealthy people rarely gasp the way they do in movies. They become very still and wait to learn which version of events will be safest to remember. The quartet stopped in the middle of a note. The officiant lowered his book. Adrian's face held its ceremonial smile for 2 seconds longer than it should have, as if his body had not yet received the message that his perfect day was coming apart. Celeste Rowan stood beside him in a silk gown that had been discussed in magazines for months. She was calm, but not bridal calm. Her shoulders were squared the way they had been the first time I met her, when she asked a room full of executives why none of them could explain where their founder's earliest patents came from. She looked at the guards, then at me. "Take your hands off her," she said. They obeyed before Adrian could answer. That was when I understood that Celeste had not invited me to reconcile a family. She had invited me because she had discovered something, and she wanted Adrian to know that the truth had arrived wearing our mother's dress. To understand why my brother wanted me removed, you have to understand that Adrian's favorite story about himself was missing 17 years. In interviews, he said he grew up poor but brilliant, escaped a dying town through scholarships, and built Vale Meridian from a folding table in a dormitory basement. The story was clean enough to fit beneath a magazine cover. It contained hardship without humiliation, struggle without debt, and a solitary genius who owed nothing to anyone. It did not contain our father's gambling. It did not contain our mother dying at 46 with collection notices hidden beneath her mattress. It did not contain the 16-year-old girl who left school to keep the electricity on while her 20-year-old brother stayed at the university that would later claim him as its most famous graduate. Most of all, it did not contain the notebook Adrian took from my room on the morning he left home for good. We were born 4 years apart in Bellwether, a river town built around a paper mill that had been shrinking since before I learned to read. Adrian was the bright child. Teachers saved his exams. Neighbors asked him to fix computers. Our mother told everyone he would build something important one day. I believed her more fiercely than anyone. I was not considered gifted in the same way. I drew machines in the margins of grocery receipts and rebuilt broken radios because replacement parts cost money. I could see how things fit together, but I hated classrooms where every problem had one approved answer. Adrian liked applause. I liked the moment a dead object moved again. When we were children, those differences made us a team. He could describe a future in language adults respected, and I could make crude versions of it from discarded motors, wire, and whatever the mill threw away. Our father, Martin, had once been a maintenance supervisor at the mill. After an accident damaged his left hand, he began betting on sports because gambling let him imagine that his judgment still controlled something. At first, he lost small amounts and hid them badly. Then he borrowed against the house. By the time our mother discovered the full debt, Adrian was already at the state university on a scholarship that covered tuition, but not housing, food, or the endless little costs that separate talented poor students from talented rich ones. My mother took extra shifts at the pharmacy. I cleaned offices after school. We sent Adrian money in envelopes because bank transfers left records our father could find. Adrian promised that when he succeeded, none of us would ever worry again. The promise mattered because we had a shared project. The mill's old ventilation system wasted enormous amounts of power by running at full speed even when sections of the plant were idle. Workers complained that management would never replace it. I had started experimenting with small sensor arrays after seeing my mother's electric bill rise. Adrian understood the software and control theory I could not yet formalize. Over 2 summers, we built a rough, adaptive power regulator on our kitchen table. My designs were ugly but practical. I used cheap components, redundant temperature checks, and a mechanical failsafe based on a device our father had shown me before the accident. Adrian wrote the predictive code and gave the system a name, Meridian, because he said it could become the line separating waste from intelligence. It was the happiest work we ever did together. We argued about everything but believed in the same destination. Our mother brought us sandwiches at midnight and kept every sketch, including the pages I tore up. When the prototype reduced power use in a friend's auto shop by almost 30%, Adrian said we had our way out. He would refine the software at university, I would finish school, and we would form a company together. We wrote the arrangement in a blue composition notebook because we could not afford a lawyer. It was not sophisticated. It said the core hardware architecture belonged to both of us, that neither would license it without the other, and that any company built from Meridian would be ours equally. We signed our names. Our mother signed as a witness. Then she drew a small star beside mine and told me never to let anyone convince me that building with my hands was less intelligent than building with equations. 6 months later, she collapsed at the pharmacy. The diagnosis was an aggressive cancer that had already spread. Our lives narrowed to hospital corridors, unpaid bills, and the terrible arithmetic of time. Adrian came home twice that semester. He cried at her bedside and talked about leaving school, but our mother refused. She told him his degree was the one investment our family could not allow our father to gamble away. I agreed with her. I told Adrian I would manage everything. At 16, I believed love was proven by how much weight you could carry without asking anyone to see it. I left school and told the administration I would return the next term. I took morning shifts at a bakery, afternoons at an appliance repair shop, and nights caring for our mother. I learned to sleep in 40-minute pieces. Adrian called less often because our conversations made him feel guilty, and I began protecting him from the worst details. I did not tell him when our father sold my tools. I did not tell him when the hospital sent our mother home because insurance refused another week. I did not tell him that I sometimes ate crackers from the pharmacy vending machine so she could have the groceries. Every month, I sent Adrian enough to stay enrolled. When he asked where the money came from, I said the repair shop was paying me well. Our mother died on a cold Tuesday in March. Adrian arrived the next morning, too late to hear her last words. He moved through the funeral like a visitor who had entered the wrong house. Grief made him angry at everything: our father, the hospital, the town, and me for not forcing him to come sooner. 3 days later, he searched our mother's room for insurance documents. He found the blue notebook beneath her mattress along with the debt notices. He asked if the prototype still worked. I said it did, but that I had dismantled part of it to pay for the funeral. Adrian said he could rebuild it at school and enter an innovation competition with a large cash prize. Winning would let him clear the most urgent debts and help me return to school. I gave him the notebook because I still thought hours meant the same thing to both of us. He won the competition. I watched the live stream from the back room of the repair shop, still wearing a shirt stained with compressor oil. Adrian stood beneath bright lights and described Meridian as a system he had developed after witnessing industrial waste in his hometown. He thanked a professor, a classmate, and our late mother. He did not say my name. I told myself the omission did not matter. The judges wanted a polished origin story, and explaining that his teenage sister designed the hardware would complicate the presentation. When he called afterward, he was breathless. A venture investor named Malcolm Sloan wanted to fund a company. Adrian said paperwork would move quickly and promised he would fix the ownership later. He needed me to trust him. I did. That decision became the hinge of my life. The company was formed as Meridian Adaptive Systems, later renamed Vale Meridian after investors insisted that Adrian's surname sounded strong. My brother sent me $2,000 from his prize, and then became increasingly difficult to reach. He said lawyers were negotiating, patents were being filed, and any informal claim from a minor could frighten investors. He told me to wait until the company had value. Meanwhile, I discovered that our father had borrowed money from people who did not send polite notices. One of them came to the repair shop and explained what would happen if the debt was not paid. I sold the last prototype, my mother's jewelry, and nearly everything in the house. The blue notebook was already gone. Adrian did eventually send money, but not as a partner. He paid off the mortgage and called it rescuing me. He arranged a private rehabilitation program for our father and called it cleaning up the family. He offered to place me in a boarding school under a different address so no journalist would connect his new company to local debt collectors. Every offer required me to become smaller and more grateful. When I asked about the company agreement, he said the technology had changed beyond recognition. My original mechanical designs were primitive, the patents covered his university work, and the blue notebook was only evidence of childhood experimentation. He promised me a job when I was older, provided I earned the right credentials. At 17, exhausted and surrounded by people who called Adrian a visionary, I doubted my own memory. I finished school through an equivalency program and entered community college, where Dr. Nisha Patel noticed that I solved safety problems in ways textbooks did not teach. She examined the few sketches our mother had mailed back to me and called them elegant, not primitive. A free legal clinic later told me that without the notebook, original prototype, or a living technical witness, challenging a venture-backed company could take years and money I did not possess. I did not sue. I watched Vale Meridian grow into an industrial automation empire while Adrian renovated our childhood home into a technology center that honored our mother and erased me. With Nisha's help, I built my own career testing emergency systems. By 30, I was the specialist companies called when an intelligent machine behaved in a way its creators claimed was impossible. Adrian optimized systems. I studied what happened when they failed. Martin Vale died in a rented room above a hardware store after years of sobriety interrupted by one final relapse. Adrian paid for a private service and hired a public relations team to keep journalists away. We stood beside the grave beneath separate umbrellas. After everyone left, he asked why I continued punishing him. I remember being struck by the question. In Adrian's mind, my independent existence was a punishment because it denied him the role of generous savior. I told him I was not punishing him. I simply refused to participate in his version of our family. He said the company had thousands of employees and millions of customers, and reopening old disputes would damage people who had nothing to do with our childhood. Then he said, our mother would have wanted peace. Using her memory that way broke something cleanly between us. I told him our mother would have wanted him to write my name where it belonged. Adrian's expression changed from sorrow to calculation. He said if I ever made a public claim, Vale Meridian would defend itself completely. The company had records, patents, witnesses, and resources. I had old resentment and a dead woman's signature no one could verify. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. We left the cemetery understanding that we were no longer siblings waiting to reconcile. We were opposing custodians of the same past. 4 years later, Adrian announced his engagement to Celeste Rowan. I knew who she was before I knew she would become my sister-in-law. Celeste had founded a nonprofit that helped cities acquire energy infrastructure without surrendering public control to private technology firms. She was wealthy in her own right, educated, politically connected, and irritatingly difficult to intimidate. Vale Meridian had competed for several of her organization's projects. In one recorded panel, she challenged Adrian's claim that automation was neutral. Technology reflected the values of whoever designed its safeguards, she said. Adrian smiled at her as if opposition were flirtation. Apparently, for them, it was. Their relationship became a business story before it became a wedding story. Magazines called them the architect and the conscience. Vale Meridian's share price rose when Celeste joined its Social Impact Advisory Council. Her family connections reassured regulators, and his wealth gave scale to her public projects. They insisted the marriage had nothing to do with strategy. Perhaps they believed that. People with power often mistake a mutually useful feeling for proof that usefulness played no part. I had no intention of attending their wedding. Adrian did not invite me, and I was grateful for the clarity. Then, 8 weeks before the ceremony, a cream envelope arrived at my office. The handwriting was Celeste's. She said she knew Adrian and I were estranged, but she hoped I would come as her guest. No assistant had sent it. No family office was copied. A second card contained a telephone number and a request that I call from a private line. I almost threw the envelope away. Curiosity won. When I called, Celeste did not waste time pretending the invitation was sentimental. She had been reviewing archived technical documents for a foundation exhibition about Vale Meridian's 20-year history. In a scanned box of early investor materials, she found references to E-Vale failsafe geometry and the siblings' kitchen prototype. Later drafts removed both phrases. She asked Adrian who E-Vale was. He said it referred to an early working title. Celeste did not believe him. She hired an archivist, who found a local newspaper photograph from the auto shop trial. The image showed Adrian beside the prototype. My arm and half my face were visible at the edge. On the back, someone had written, Adrian and Elena Vale test their Meridian controller, August 17th. Celeste asked whether I had helped create the original system. I told her that helped was the word people used when they wanted a woman's contribution to sound optional. There was a long silence. Then she apologized, not on Adrian's behalf, which would have angered me, but for choosing the word. She asked me to tell her what happened. I gave her the outline and refused to send documents. I had spent too many years being treated as a threat to hand evidence to the woman marrying my brother. Celeste said she understood. She also said there were weaknesses in Vale Meridian's newest safety platform, Aegis, and several engineers believed the company had rushed deployment before the wedding because Adrian wanted to announce a major government contract at the reception. My name had appeared in an internal risk memo as the external specialist most qualified to review the fail-safe architecture. Adrian personally ordered the team not to contact me. That information disturbed me more than the archive. Aegis controlled automated power isolation in hospitals and transit systems. If its failure logic inherited an old weakness, the consequences would not be about credit or family. I asked Celeste to send the technical concern through proper channels. She said she could not access the restricted reports without alerting Adrian, but she would find a lawful route. Before ending the call, she repeated the invitation. She said she was not asking me to bless the marriage. She wanted me present because she intended to ask Adrian for the truth before she took his vows, and she did not want him to describe me as an abstraction. I told her a wedding was a cruel place for an interrogation. Celeste answered that the cruelty had begun long before the wedding. Still, she promised she would speak to him privately first. I agreed to attend only if Adrian knew I had been invited. She said she would tell him. That was my first mistake with Celeste. I assumed her honesty would force honesty from him. 3 days later, Adrian called me for the first time since our father's funeral. He sounded warm, cautious, almost embarrassed. He said Celeste had found fragments of old records and was romanticizing our childhood collaboration. He did not want unresolved family history to become a shadow over the wedding. If I attended, he asked that I avoid discussing business, patents, our parents, Bellwether, or the years we had been apart. The list was so complete that it left us nothing to discuss except the weather. He offered to arrange travel and a suite at the venue. I declined both and asked whether he was inviting me as his sister. Adrian said labels were not helpful. I told him truth generally disliked being called a label. He ended the call by saying he hoped I would make the mature choice. I should have stayed home. Instead, I examined public records about Aegis and found reports suggesting that under sensor disagreement and network delay, the system could postpone a local emergency shutdown while seeking central confirmation. I sent the concern to its independent certifier. Adrian responded by making my wedding invitation conditional on a confidentiality agreement that also released every past intellectual property claim. He had finally placed a price on my seat, my right to tell the truth. I refused to sign, but Celeste insisted her invitation remained valid. The wedding was held at St. Orison Abbey on a private island off Maine. I paid my own way and arrived by public ferry, while the other guests moved through clouds of assistants and garment bags. My name appeared only on the bride's private list. I pinned Celeste's pale blue corsage to our mother's old dress in a restroom near the kitchens. The venue displayed enormous photographs of Adrian's carefully edited life, including a replica prototype credited entirely to him. My design, my mother's kitchen, and my absence had become museum facts. Before I could answer, Adrian appeared. He wore a black morning coat, and for one disorienting second, I saw the brother who had practiced scholarship interviews in our bathroom mirror. Then his gaze moved to our mother's dress and hardened. He asked what I was doing there. I said Celeste invited me. He insisted she had withdrawn the invitation. I showed him the most recent message on my phone, sent less than an hour earlier. I'm glad you came. Please stay through the vows, no matter what happens. Adrian read it twice. He lowered his voice and told me Celeste was under extreme pressure. Her father's health was poor, the press was relentless, and my presence would create confusion. He asked me, just once, to put his happiness ahead of my grievance. I reminded him that I had put his future ahead of my education, my home, my credit, and my own work. He said that was exactly the kind of accounting that made reconciliation impossible. People who loved each other did not keep ledgers. It was an astonishing sentence from a man whose lawyers had spent 20 years calculating exactly how little of his company belonged to me. I told him I would remain because the bride had asked me to remain. Adrian's eyes went flat. He signaled to a woman wearing an event headset and walked away. Within minutes, my assigned seat in the third row disappeared from the digital chart. An usher moved me to the rear under the excuse of balancing family sections. I accepted the seat. I had not come to be seen. I had come because Celeste's message sounded like a warning, and because somewhere inside the celebration, my brother was preparing to announce a system I believed could kill people. The ceremony began at sunset. Light passed through the old chapel windows and turned the air amber. Celeste walked alone, without her father, who watched from the front row in a wheelchair. She looked neither left nor right until she reached Adrian. Then she glanced toward the back and found me. It was not a warm look. It was confirmation. The officiant spoke about partnership, truth, and the joining of two lives. Adrian's public face returned. He held Celeste's hands with practiced tenderness. When the officiant invited them to exchange personal vows, Adrian began with a story about building systems that could adapt to uncertainty. He said love was the one force he had learned not to control. Guests smiled. I thought of the confidentiality agreement. My phone vibrated inside my bag. The message came from an unknown number. It contained a photograph of a document labeled Aegis Critical Incident Review and one sentence. He knew about Rotterdam before certification. I opened the image. The visible page described a failure in which a local emergency command had been delayed by the central optimizer. 3 engineers recommended suspending deployment. Adrian's electronic approval appeared beneath the decision to classify the event as an integration anomaly and proceed. I looked up. Adrian had finished his vows. The officiant turned to Celeste. She did not begin. Her eyes were on the phone in my hand. At the edge of the chapel, Adrian's head of security whispered into his sleeve. 2 guards approached my row. One leaned down and asked me to come with him. I said I would leave after the ceremony. He told me the groom had revoked my access, and that refusal would be treated as trespassing. Guests began to turn. Adrian watched from the altar. I gave him every opportunity to stop what was happening. He did not. Instead, he made that tiny boardroom gesture. The guards took my arms. I rose because resisting would let Adrian transform a moral question into a security incident. The aisle seemed longer from the back. Cameras lifted as I stepped toward it. I heard someone whisper that I was a protester. Another person said I was Adrian Vale's sister. That contradiction moved through the room faster than any explanation. Then Celeste stopped the ceremony. If Elena leaves, I leave too. Adrian released her hands. His smile vanished, leaving not anger at first, but disbelief. He asked Celeste to step into the sacristy so they could speak privately. She refused. She said privacy had protected him long enough. Then she turned toward the guests and apologized for the interruption. She explained that she had spent weeks trying to determine whether the man she intended to marry had concealed material facts about his company, his family, and a safety failure involving Aegis. That morning, she received confirmation on all 3. The room changed. Family scandal fascinated people, but product liability frightened them. Several guests were Vale Meridian directors. Others represented the government consortium expected to award the Aegis contract. Phones appeared despite the ceremony's no recording rule. Malcolm Sloan stood as if he intended to intervene, then seemed to reconsider when Celeste named the Rotterdam incident. Adrian said she was misunderstanding technical documents stolen by a disgruntled employee. Celeste asked whether he had approved continued deployment after 3 engineers recommended suspension. He answered that the review was preliminary. She asked whether he had instructed his legal department to silence the original co-inventor of Meridian before the wedding. He said I was not an inventor. Celeste looked at me. Elena, do you have your mother's notebook? For a moment, I could not speak. Adrian's expression told me he believed she meant the blue composition book he had taken. I said he had it, or he had destroyed it. Celeste reached beneath the flowers on a side table and lifted a sealed archival case. Inside was the blue notebook. Seeing it was like seeing my mother walk into the chapel. The cover was warped from a coffee spill. A strip of silver tape held the spine. My handwriting, slanted and impatient, showed through the first page. I stopped breathing normally. Adrian stared at the case. Malcolm Sloan sat down. Celeste explained that the notebook had been stored for 19 years in Sloan Capital's founding archive, along with the materials Adrian presented during his first investment meeting. An archivist located it after finding the old newspaper photograph. The first half contained my hardware drawings, dated before Adrian's university work. The partnership agreement and our mother's witness signature were in the center. The final pages contained meeting notes written by Malcolm Sloan. One line recorded a question about the minor sister's ownership. The answer, attributed to Adrian, said I had surrendered my interest in exchange for family debt payments and did not want public involvement. I had never surrendered anything. No document bearing my signature existed because no one had asked me. Celeste said the archive also contained an early patent draft listing Elena Vale as co-inventor. A later draft removed my name after counsel received a representation that I contributed only general concepts. The patent history did not merely support a family grievance. It created a potential chain of title defect across the foundational portfolio Vale Meridian used to secure financing, acquisitions, and government contracts. Adrian finally lost control. He accused Celeste of staging an ambush and me of manipulating her. He said the notebook proved nothing because we had been children experimenting together. The commercial invention came later through his code, his team, and his leadership. I agreed that thousands of people had improved Meridian after our kitchen prototype. I had never claimed otherwise. But improvement did not erase origin, and leadership did not convert another person's work into a childhood anecdote. He turned on me then, in front of everyone. He said I had always resented that he possessed the discipline to turn our ideas into something real. He had carried the risk, persuaded investors, hired employees, and spent 2 decades building value while I waited at the edges for a moment of maximum leverage. His words were polished because he had rehearsed them privately for years. I walked toward the altar after the guards released me. I did not raise my voice. I said I was not the person who chose the wedding. I had asked Celeste to speak with him in private. I had stayed silent for nearly 20 years, not because his story was true, but because he had made truth unaffordable. He possessed the notebook, the lawyers, the patents, and the public narrative. I possessed memory. Now that the evidence had survived him, he wanted my silence to be proof that nothing happened, and my speech to be proof that I wanted attention. There was no behavior he would accept except disappearance. Adrian looked at Celeste and said, "Love required trust." She replied that trust was not a gift the deceived person owed the deceiver. She removed his ring from her finger and placed it on the officiant's book. The sound was small, but every person in the chapel heard it. The ceremony ended without a marriage. What followed was less dignified. Vale Meridian's general counsel tried to secure the notebook, claiming it was company property. Celeste's attorney produced documentation showing the archive had released it to an independent custodian under court preservation protocols that morning. Security attempted to collect guests' phones, but Celeste's statement had already been streamed by at least 4 people. Her communications director issued a written announcement before Adrian's team could draft one. It said Celeste Rowan had postponed the wedding after receiving credible evidence requiring investigation. It did not mention infidelity, nerves, or private family strain. It named governance, intellectual property, and public safety. The Aegis document had come from one of the 3 engineers who recommended suspension. Celeste had not known it would reach me during the vows, but she had known the engineer planned to release the report to regulators and directors that day. She chose the ceremony because it was the only room where Adrian could not isolate every witness, close every channel, and turn each person's knowledge into a separate problem. I understood the logic. I still felt used. I told Celeste the notebook should have come to me before the wedding. She agreed. The archive's attorneys had insisted on controlled custody once they recognized its legal importance. She had arranged for me to receive a forensic copy, but she wanted Adrian confronted before anyone could claim the notebook had been altered while in my possession. Every choice made sense, and still left me standing inside someone else's strategy. That was the pattern I knew too well. Powerful people deciding that my lack of power made me the most flexible piece on the board. Celeste did not ask me to forgive her. She gave me the name of the independent custodian and said the notebook would remain sealed until a court or mutually appointed examiner documented it. She also handed me a folder containing the early patent draft, archive logs, and correspondence. Then she said something I did not expect. She had no intention of marrying Adrian, even if every legal issue disappeared. She had watched him order my removal with the ease of a man discarding evidence. Whatever explanation he offered afterward could not make that gesture unseen. Outside the library, the island had become a crisis center. Ferries were delayed while guests negotiated with assistants. News helicopters circled beyond the protected airspace. Vale Meridian's board called an emergency meeting. The government consortium suspended its Aegis announcement. Adrian remained in the chapel with Malcolm Sloan and 2 lawyers. For once, I did not wonder whether he was all right. I left on a service boat with kitchen staff because the main dock was blocked by media. My mother's dress smelled faintly of rain and smoke from the chapel candles. At the Mainland Hotel, reporters filled the lobby. I used a laundry exit and walked 6 blocks to my small room. There were 63 missed calls on my phone. One was from Adrian. His message was not an apology. He said Celeste had destroyed the wedding and endangered the company, but I could still prevent permanent damage. He proposed that we meet with a mediator before markets opened Monday. He would acknowledge that I participated in early experiments, establish a foundation in our mother's name, and compensate me generously. In return, I would affirm that Adrian alone developed the patentable inventions and that I had no ownership claim. He ended by saying thousands of employees depended on me making a responsible decision. For years, that argument had silenced me. Adrian placed a crowd of innocent people between himself and accountability, then accused anyone seeking accountability of threatening the crowd. This time, I forwarded the message to an attorney. Her name was Ruth Okafor, and she specialized in inventorship disputes involving technology companies with more money than patience. Nisha had introduced us years earlier, but I had never retained her because there was too little evidence. At 2 a.m, Ruth reviewed the archive index and told me the case had changed completely. The notebook, patent draft, and investor notes could support claims for correction of inventorship, breach of agreement, fraud, and unjust enrichment. Statutes of limitation would be contested, but concealment and the recent discovery of evidence mattered. More importantly, the chain of title issue gave Vale Meridian a reason to negotiate that had nothing to do with affection. I asked what would happen to employees if I pursued the claim. Ruth said ownership disputes did not require destroying a company. They required deciding who had the right to what. Adrian had trained me to imagine only 2 options: silence or ruin. That false choice was one of his strongest defenses. By sunrise, clips from the chapel had spread around the world. Most headlines focused on the billionaire abandoned at the altar. Some called me a secret sister, as if Adrian had kept me in a tower. Others described me as a patent claimant who crashed the wedding, despite video showing I had been seated quietly until security approached. Vale Meridian issued a statement accusing unnamed parties of circulating incomplete archival material. Celeste responded by publishing her invitation to me and confirming that I attended at her request. At 9, the company's independent directors placed Adrian on temporary leave, pending investigations into Aegis and the founding patents. Malcolm Sloan resigned as board chair to avoid distraction. Aegis deployments were paused. Regulators in 3 countries requested incident records. Vale Meridian shares fell sharply, then stabilized when the board announced that existing systems would continue operating under independent safety oversight. Adrian called again. I let Ruth answer. The next weeks were a lesson in how quickly private history becomes a marketplace. Bellwether residents produced photographs, repair invoices, and a recording of our auto shop demonstration. Nisha supplied the pages our mother had mailed to me. Forensic examiners matched the paper, ink, handwriting, and technical evolution to the notebook. Adrian's lawyers argued that siblings casually exchanged ideas, and that his debt payments had purchased whatever interest I possessed. Ruth asked for an agreement showing I accepted those payments as consideration. There was none. Then, discovery revealed something worse. In the company's first year, outside patent counsel had asked Adrian to obtain an assignment from me, out of an abundance of caution. Adrian replied that I was estranged, unstable after our mother's death, and unlikely to understand the documents. He recommended waiting until I turned 18, then never followed up. In a separate message to Malcolm Sloan, he wrote that acknowledging me would complicate the founder narrative and expose the company to guardianship review because I was a minor. Malcolm answered, "Resolve quietly after financing." They had not forgotten me. They had postponed me until I became inconvenient, then treated the inconvenience as proof that I had no place. When I read those emails, I did not feel vindicated. I remembered myself at 17, standing in the grocery store with a calculator, deciding whether we could afford our mother's medication and Adrian's meal plan. While I was ashamed of not understanding contracts, men in clean offices were discussing how my lack of understanding could protect them. The emails left me grieving the brother I had kept inventing beneath the man Adrian chose to become. Celeste, now attacked daily by tabloids, resigned from Vale Meridian's advisory council and gave investigators every relevant record. The independent board asked me to join the Aegis review under regulatory oversight. We reproduced the Rotterdam delay and designed a retrofit restoring one absolute principle from my original architecture. When a human at the point of danger pulled an emergency control, remote optimization could not silently overrule it. We called the fix the local sovereignty standard. The employees who built it were not responsible for Adrian's treatment of me, and protecting their work became part of every legal demand I made. Adrian returned to the headquarters once during the review to give evidence to a board committee. We encountered each other in the prototype lab. He looked older than he had at the wedding, though only 2 months had passed. Without cameras, his confidence seemed less like strength than an exhausting structure he had to hold upright. He asked whether I was enjoying his office. I said the safety lab was not his office. He said everything in the building existed because he made it possible. I looked around at engineers, technicians, custodians, assistants, and decades of accumulated work. That sentence explained more than any legal filing. Adrian truly believed creation flowed outward from him. Other people did not build the company, they inhabited his achievement. He said the board was preparing to remove him permanently, and that Celeste would not answer his messages. He blamed me for both. I told him Celeste watched him order security to remove his sister from their wedding. He replied that I had arrived intending to humiliate him. I showed him her invitation. He said I should have understood that my presence was destabilizing. Then he asked what I wanted. Not what was fair, not what happened. What price would restore his control? I told him I wanted corrected inventorship on every patent derived from our original architecture. I wanted an accurate public history. I wanted compensation reflecting the interest he took, not a charitable payment he could describe as generosity. I wanted employee equity protected from the settlement. I wanted the Aegis findings published and the retrofit funded before executive bonuses. Finally, I wanted the Bellwether Center's false exhibit removed and replaced with the real story, including our father's failures, our mother's labor, and the fact that innovation did not arrive from a lone genius. Adrian said those demands would dismantle his legacy. I said they would dismantle only the parts built from my disappearance. He offered me $20 million to keep the patents unchanged. The number was large enough to make headlines and small enough to reveal what he still thought I was. I declined. He raised it twice. Ruth ended the meeting. Settlement negotiations continued for 5 months. Vale Meridian could have fought for years, but the uncertainty threatened contracts and financing. The independent directors also discovered that Malcolm Sloan had concealed the early patent draft during 2 acquisition reviews. Insurers reserved their rights. Government customers demanded clean title. Adrian's position weakened each time a new institution realized his private decision had become its public risk. We did not receive half the company. The childhood agreement could not simply divide 20 years of later investment and labor. Ruth never promised a fairy tale judgment. What we achieved was more precise. 4 foundational patents were corrected to name me as co-inventor. Vale Meridian acknowledged that the first Meridian system was jointly created by Adrian and me. I received a significant equity stake and back compensation calculated through an independent valuation. A portion went into a trust that could not be diluted by future financing. Another portion funded safety research and technical education for students who entered engineering through non-traditional routes. Most important to me, the settlement explicitly stated that Adrian's payments for our family debts were not consideration for my intellectual property. Feeding your sister while using her work did not become a purchase merely because you kept receipts. Adrian resigned as chief executive and gave up his board seat for at least 5 years. He retained substantial shares and remained extremely wealthy. Accountability did not make him poor, it simply made him no longer the sole author of everything. Malcolm Sloan settled separate claims with the company and stepped away from his investment firm. He issued an apology written by lawyers. I read it once and filed it. Some words arrived too late to perform the work their speakers assigned them. The public correction created another wave of attention. Reporters wanted a triumphant sister versus billionaire story. Producers offered documentaries. A publisher proposed a memoir with a cover showing me outside the chapel. I declined most of it. I gave one technical interview about the Meridian architecture and one longer conversation about invisible contributors in startup history. I refused to describe the wedding as revenge. Revenge would have been choosing the moment. I had spent years avoiding the moment until Adrian's own choices created it. Celeste and I did not become instant friends. Real life rarely rewards betrayal with a new, perfect relationship. I respected her and remained angry that she had placed me inside a confrontation without fully telling me what she planned. She respected that anger. Over time, we worked together on public infrastructure safety standards. She never used our connection for publicity, and when asked why she stopped the wedding, she gave the same answer. because a marriage cannot begin by helping one person erase another. A year after the failed ceremony, the Bellwether Technology Center closed for renovation. I returned with Nisha to help redesign the exhibit. The glass replica disappeared. In its place, we installed our battered kitchen table, recovered from a storage unit our father had rented and forgotten. The forensic process returned the blue notebook after every page had been scanned and preserved. I placed it in the case myself. The new display did not call me a hidden genius or call Adrian a thief. It explained the work honestly. Elena Vale designed the physical architecture and fail-safe mechanisms. Adrian Vale developed predictive control software and led commercialization. Their mother, Lillian Marin Vale, preserved the records and supported both children while working through illness. Later engineers transformed the prototype into a global platform. The display included the patent correction, the Aegis failure, and the local sovereignty standard. Creation was shown as a chain of people, choices, improvements, and responsibilities. On the morning the exhibit opened, Adrian came before the public arrived. He had not told me he would be there. For once, no security moved between us. He stood before the photograph from the auto shop, the one in which half my face appeared at the edge. The exhibit designer had found the uncropped negative. In the full image, I was kneeling beside the controller with a screwdriver in my teeth, while Adrian pointed toward a monitor. We both looked tired and delighted. He asked whether I remembered the test. I did. The main sensor failed because he had mounted it too close to a compressor, and my backup loop kept the system stable. We had argued for an hour, then eaten melted ice cream on the curb. Adrian smiled at the memory, but the smile did not repair anything. He said he had told himself he was protecting the company until it became strong enough to include me. Then the company grew, and inclusion became more expensive. Every year, admitting the truth would have cost more money, more reputation, and more of the identity he had built. Eventually, he needed to believe I had contributed less because the alternative was believing he had stolen more. He said this without asking me to excuse it. I asked why he ordered security to remove me from the wedding. Adrian looked at our mother's dress, which I had donated to the exhibit beside a photograph of her at his scholarship dinner. He said when he saw me wearing it, he knew Celeste had discovered the part of him he could not explain. If I stayed, he would have to choose between confessing and lying in front of someone whose respect he wanted. Removing me felt easier. That answer was selfish, cowardly, and true. It was the first thing he had given me without editing. He apologized. Not for the scandal, the lost position, or the value of the settlement. He apologized for taking the notebook, for letting me leave school while he accepted the story that he escaped alone, for converting help into ownership, and for using our mother as a weapon when I asked for recognition. He did not ask whether I forgave him. I told him I did not know what forgiveness would mean between us. I would not restore him to the place he occupied before he betrayed me, because that place existed only when I was a child. I would not protect him from the natural discomfort of being accurately known. But I was willing to let the truth remain still between us without using it as a blade every time we met. Adrian nodded. We walked through the exhibit separately. He has not returned to Vale Meridian. Last I heard, he was teaching a small seminar on technology governance and refusing interview requests. Some people call that reinvention. Others call it exile. I do not decide what it means for him. My equity made me wealthy, though not in the spectacular way Adrian lived. I bought Nisha's former laboratory building and converted it into an independent safety institute. We pay apprentices, including teenagers who need money more urgently than credentials. Our first question is not where they studied. It is what they have built, repaired, noticed, or refused to ignore. The blue notebook remains in Bellwether, open to the page with our agreement and our mother's star. Visitors often focus on the signatures because they know what followed. I focus on the sketches around them. Two young people were trying to solve a real problem with limited tools. Before money, patents, and fear rearranged us, we trusted each other enough to imagine a shared future. Sometimes people ask whether I am grateful Celeste stopped the ceremony. Grateful is not the right word. I am grateful that the notebook survived. I am grateful the Aegis flaw was found before someone died. I am grateful that when my brother tried to turn my removal into a silent administrative task, one person in the room refused to continue as though nothing had happened. But the moment I remember most is not Celeste lifting her veil or Adrian losing his company. It is the instant after the guards released my arms. I had spent nearly 20 years believing powerful hands could move me wherever they wanted because resistance would cost too much. Then I stood in the center aisle wearing my mother's old blue dress, with every polished version of my brother's life watching, and understood that I no longer needed his permission to remain. The bride stopped the ceremony. The evidence stopped the lie. But I was the one who finally stopped leaving.